I think if we celebrate what we have become, despite the ups and downs, we really have transformed the country, and for the better. So,
yeah,
you know, it is a reason to celebrate.
Truth and Reconciliation, if you read it, there's 90-some calls to action. And that we could take that and template it over almost any country on this planet. So part of my feeling is that's not just a call of action to action for Canada and reconciliation. That is a call to action for the planet.
Navigating cultural differences is not easy for everyone. So we need to find a way where we can relate across our differences as equals. And I think that we're still working on that project.
Canada is a banner carrier for freedom of expression, freedom of choice, and freedom to live here in the best country in the world called Canada.
From the Zoomerplex in historic Liberty Village, the Zoomer with Libby Znaimer.
This is Isabella Elise Tomaso, everybody. That was wonderful. She's only 11, but she's been doing this for years. So, Isabella, what inspired you to start singing?
My grandfather inspired me to start singing, and I just have a lot of people around me that support me, so.
That's wonderful. You're doing a wonderful job. Thank you. So now let's tee up the topic, our celebration of Canada's sesquicentennial or 150th birthday.
From the toonie to Timbits to Tukes, this is Canada, the true north, strong and free. And this year, we're celebrating a very special birthday, the big 150, the sesquicentennial. So, to honor this great land, here are a few more of our favorite things about Canada. You probably already know Canada is home to some of the world's greatest inventions, like the telephone and the game of basketball. Canadians also invented the walkie-talkie, the goalie mask, and even the Wonder Bra. Canada's also famous for the sweet stuff. Over 70% of the world's maple syrup comes from the Great White North. And did you know that Canada has its own Dead Sea? Saskatchewan's Little Manitou Lake salt content makes it impossible to sink. Speaking of lakes, Canada has more of these than all other countries combined. More than 60% of the world's lakes are here. And of course, we're the only country to have a direct line to Santa. No postage required.
Coming up after the break, we talk about the changing face of Canadian immigration.
Immigration is so political now, especially with the world as well, with the United States, with Donald Trump, and what is the value that we place on our immigration policies and on immigrants?
I was born in wartime Tajikistan. Infant mortality in Kuyab, Tajikistan during wartime was like well over 90%. So here I am born into this situation and of course immediately contracted all the local tropical diseases. Apparently I had malaria, I had tuberculosis, I had typhus, I had whatever. And the only way to save me was for my mother to mutilate herself. She cut herself very savagely in order to qualify for entry into the hospital, and because she was then in the hospital at the same time that I was, in other words, that she would have been discharged and I would have been left. That is what saved me. The story is, my mother was running on her own. My dad was moving with a little group of his buddies from his place of birth, which had been in Latvia. And my mom overheard them as a little group chattering with each other and speaking in Yiddish with bits of Hebrew. And so she knew these were fellow Jews, and she went over, introduced herself, and managed to hook up with this little gang. Ultimately, she paired off with my dad. His buddies kept on going, and they apparently were caught at the Tajik-Afghan border and were summarily executed. In the immediate aftermath of the war, my parents scanned the world trying to find somebody, anybody, because their families had been destroyed. And eventually found this one fairly distant relative left alive who lived in a funny place called Montreal, Quebec, Canada. And the voyage was wild, as I recall, or at least my parents were deathly ill through the whole thing. I roamed free around the boat for the 2 weeks. I'd bring my parents food, whatever they could hold down. But it was in that 2 weeks that I learned how to speak English. That's what happened. What we have as a remnant of this whole passage is shots of me, cute little plaid jacket, and a red cross tag. Ended up on the front cover of the largest circulating magazine in Canada at the time. Once we arrived here, I don't have as much clarity. I'm hoping by walking through these doors, something more will come to me. So nobody stayed here overnight?
Well, they did, but in another space.
Okay.
And, separate from where you would have come in when you arrived.
Fred Smithers Wallach ship, so let me find my ship.
Mostly people who have come to Canada through Pier 21, we have them write their memories. Or
yeah, we saw that on the way through, didn't we? Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know if you're interested in maybe writing something.
Oh, sure, it'd be my pleasure.
If I may.
That was my brother Moses and my family's immigration story, just one of many courageous journeys taken to immigrate here. I've always been very proud of being the first person in my family to be born in Canada. But I'm also keenly aware that it was a stroke of luck that has brought me many advantages in life. And now we're all about celebrating diversity, but when I watch my brother's video, I have to remember that during the Holocaust, the policy on Jewish refugees was none is too many. During the war, some 22,000 Japanese Canadians were expelled from their homes and ultimately stripped of their property. And of course, there was the infamous poll tax on Chinese workers at the beginning of the 20th century. Elizabeth Long, not only are you an immigrant, you are an immigration lawyer and a refugee advocate. So let's start with your take on how our immigration policy has evolved.
Immigration is so political now, especially with the world as well, with the United States, with Donald Trump, and whether or not what is the value that we place on our immigration policies and on immigrants. Immigration is all about the government's choice as to who to allow into the country. Should we only allow people, for example, who speak very good English and French? Or should we allow people who are young? Based on the current immigration system, you could have someone like Einstein who wouldn't be allowed to be able to come into the country. And then, of course, we have family sponsorship. And I don't know if you've heard, but there's the recent change in parental sponsorship, where only in the last, it was a lottery system, where only 1 out of 10 people could actually be picked out and win the lottery ticket to sponsor their parents or grandparents.
Some of this immigration policy where it's young people with skill sets and this and this and this, maybe we're missing a huge piece of wisdom that could be brought in from other places. I also look at the why of immigration. You know, originally it was uncontrolled. If you could get over here, basically you were good to get in. There was reasons. Freedom was a big thing. What was happening in Europe in the different places, what was going on. There was also the sad component of being brought here against your will. That was a sad thing. Most people, I think, again, I recognize that you brought here against your will, but there was a desire for hope, for a new life, for a future, for land. Land acquisition was a big thing, and certainly capitalism played a great role in the fur trade.
Andrea, the government now is emphasizing our brand is kind of diversity and welcoming of people from around the world. In your experience, is that genuine?
I think that we walk a very thin line where we have to be careful that what we're not demonstrating is a kind of assumption of some kind of ultra-liberalism, right? That Canadians can feel comfortable with being so open, so liberal, that we don't understand the ways in which we are in fact being exclusive. I think that differences and navigating cultural differences is not easy for everyone. So we need to find a way where we can relate across our differences as equals. And I think that we're still working on that project.
Lieutenant General, you've seen this country change a lot.
The reality is, since I came to Toronto, which was in 1948, I had just finished a participation in World War II. As a 20-year-old, I did 135 low-level reconnaissance missions in my Mustang airplane, and it being shot at all the time, but worked for the Army. But I came back to a city, Toronto, to go to law school. And Toronto at that point was, yes, the community was British, almost totally British, and there were no foreigners, if you will, in the community. We were nothing in terms of a city of the kind we are now. And it's all changed because of immigration. Some immigration was difficult, some was really big time. It all fluctuated because the immigration policies have never been constant. What has been constant is the willingness of Canada to take people in reasonably large numbers, and that is one of the great advantages of Canada.
M.A., what is your take? How long have you been in the country, and what's your experience coming here?
Oh, I came to Canada, I think, not so long ago. It's about 27 years. And I think I'm blessed. I will say I'm blessed enough to be Canadian, to be citizen of this beautiful, great country, even though there's still a lot of room for improvement. I think Canada is one of the rare Western countries who is really trying to find a way to eliminate, if we can say that, what not many people want to talk about, discrimination.
What was your experience?
Oof. Even now, if I talk to you about my experience, you will be shocked. My experience as just black, one of those at the lower level of the ladder who, whenever he tries not to be the Negro, has to face so much trouble, mental distress because of the discrimination. So, and it is shocking to see that one of the ways to eliminate discrimination is not to ghettoize people, because you're trying to consider everybody equal, but at the same time, you're putting people in boxes, different boxes, and this is where you belong. This is where you belong. This is where you belong. And it goes so far that minority becomes visible in this country.
So when I was growing up, I very much felt ethnic and different and a minority, and now it's like I'm just a white chick. I don't really like that. So, I mean, I'm sure it does show how far we've come. Is it just a matter, David, you think, that every group has its day?
Oh, absolutely. You know, you go through even recent history. I mean, I graduated from high school in Scarborough in 1970, and it's a student population of just under 2,000 students. We probably had 40 or 50 blacks in the entire school. There was maybe another 40 or 50 Asian students, and ethnic, quote unquote, were the Italian students. And they were, you know, just part of the whole package, but the vast majority of the students, overwhelming majority, it was just a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant community, if you will. By the time the school closed, some 25 years later, thereabouts, it represented the change that occurred not only in Scarborough, but throughout all of Toronto. And that is just a complete cross-sampling of colors and cultures and languages. So it is a factor of time as we just progress.
Okay. Coming up, many in Canada's Indigenous communities are less than thrilled with the hoopla around Canada 150. That's next.
A few years ago, I could ask my students, who here knows about residential school? And sometimes out of a class of 200, maybe 3 or 4 would put up their hands. That's changing dramatically, so the history is being taught.
Indigenous Canadians have been here a lot longer than 150 years, and to many of them, Confederation was the beginning of an ongoing betrayal marked by residential schools, the 60s scoop, murdered and missing women. The Trudeau government made reconciliation with our First Peoples an official theme of Canada 150. And in that spirit, Vancouver changed the name of the celebration there to Canada 150 Plus. Kat Criger, you're an elder and a traditional teacher. What's your take on this?
What's my take on this? I have to point out that I'm Cayugan from the Six Nations, as well as I'm German English. So I have some mixed DNA going on. And I have to respect both of my beginnings, both of my roots, I guess we'll call them. And when I think of length of time for being here, 150 years is short. I think most of my ancestors have been here about 13,000 years. So we have that little edge going on. But also, obviously, part of my family at some point immigrated. So I have to recognize that. And I have to underscore also, I can't speak Pan-American Indigenous. I can only speak for myself. Others would have their own thoughts and ideas. So certainly when we look at some of the history that has not been taught, and we were discussing what was missing out of Canada's history, that there's a lot of stuff not recognized. The residential schools. I speak with my students. I'm embedded at the University Mississauga campus, U of T. And when, a few years ago I could ask my students, who here knows about residential school? And sometimes out of a class of 200, maybe 3 or 4 would put up their hands. That's changing dramatically. So the history is being taught. And when I look at Canada as a country, I realize 150 years ago, I don't think it was till the mid-40s that Canada completed, or maybe a little later. All the provinces joined, etc.
Yeah, Newfoundland, 1949.
Yeah.
So it's actually a very young country. So my take sometimes when I read Sir John A. Macdonald, the father of our country, and usually my assistant has the little quote up, which basically talks about residential school, how we needed to be put in residential school, that we had to be separated from our parents, from our culture, from our language, from our belief system. Otherwise, we were just savages who could read and write, which is a little bit of not complimentary. But there's something I always look for, and that is, personally, I like to move forward. I like to see things change, and the word reconciliation does say something about that.
And does the fact that this reconciliation seems to be a central part of the theme for Canada 150, how do you view that? Does that make you feel good, or?
I would like it to be that way. I'm going to stick my neck out and say probably a great number of Canadians do not know the history. So making that part of the history, or part of the main focus may or may not be represented across the board. And certainly, I guess certainly with the number of people that look at the idea of truth and reconciliation, the calls to action. That truth and reconciliation, if you read it, there's 90 some calls to action. And that we could take that and template it over almost any country on this planet. So part of my feeling is that's not just a call of action to action for Canada and reconciliation. That is a call to action for the planet.
Well, I agree a large part. I've had the privilege of working with Kat when he was at the U of T Scarborough campus where I teach. I think if we celebrate what we have become, because most of us at this table, not all of us, but most of us remember Centennial Year in 1967, 50 years ago. I mean, that was a time of enormous optimism for the future. And I remember as a 17-year-old boy, I mean, just finishing high school, looking ahead going, wow, we have pretty much an unlimited future. Well, you could make a very strong argument that over the last 50 years, despite the ups and downs, we really have transformed the country, and for the better. So, it is a reason to celebrate.
I think in terms of the world, I mean, I'm getting so many calls, from people around the world who really see Canada now as a beacon of light.
Because Canada is still young, you make sure that your young children actually get the good habit before becoming teenagers, because when they become teenagers, then without you doing this, then you are in trouble. And that's where my hope lies, actually, that even though, because if you question blacks, First Nations, yes, you will see that there is still big pains, but those pains will not hide the promise of this great land, of this great country, because people are fighting for it to become better.
Okay, well, let's hope that youth isn't wasted on the young in our case. Coming up after the break, the legacy of our military and our ties to the British monarchy.
Wherever you see the British parliamentary tradition, you generally have stable governments with rights and freedoms that simply don't exist anywhere else.
The other day, I talked to a politician whose parents were both liberated by Canadian soldiers on different continents after World War II. I think that's a quintessentially Canadian story that highlights the legacy of our veterans. So how has the legacy of what we have done both in war and as peacekeepers informed what we've become?
The reality is that in World War I, the British ran everything. We sent soldiers over, and the British decided what we would do and how we would fight the battles. But the British did the same thing in World War II. It was their tradition, because we Canadians were, you know,
colonials.
Colonial, rough colonials, not just colonials, rough colonials. So the British attitude toward us did not change from World War I to II. We were inferior people, in effect. We've overcome that now, I think, very substantially in terms of our relationship with the British military. But the reality is the influence of the Brits on us continues. So the royal family, it continues through our association with them as they have the mother of our parliament. So in any event, our association with the United Kingdom is very strong, but it's just now on a polite name basis. We have a parliament that is very effective. It's far better than the American style, where the prime minister here is in charge. When he makes a decision, he doesn't have to go to a whole bunch of Congress and so forth. He and his cabinet will do it.
David, you're the former lieutenant governor. You represent the Queen here in Ontario. That's the system that we have. I saw a recent poll that said that if the Queen passes the throne on to Prince Charles, the majority of Canadians would say cut ties to the monarchy. I'm not sure that's a very practical thing to do.
No, it's not practical, and the next thing would be, even if you did try to do it, constitutionally it would be almost impossible. Where we are now is because of consecutive decisions that have been made not only by Parliament, but by the courts, and by the role of various governors general and lieutenant governors throughout history. And so what we have become is very, very different than what we were in the 1820s, when we regularly imprisoned the mentally ill, and the physically disabled were also imprisoned. That was before, you know, residential schools. We just put disabled people in prisons. And we've changed, and we've continued to change. And a large part of that has to do because of what I would say, quite bluntly, in support of what the General was just saying, we have a qualitatively superior political system. And it is because of the British parliamentary tradition. Wherever you see the British parliamentary tradition, you generally have stable governments with rights and freedoms that simply don't exist anywhere else.
Okay. Coming up, our audience have incredible immigration stories of their own to share, and we'll have that after the next break.
So when we applied for Canada, our main objective was only for the bright future of our 4 children.
Welcome back. Now it's time to get to your stories. And our first immigration story is Sybil from Guyana. Hi, welcome.
My roots are from Guyana. I left Guyana at an early age and I went to England to study. Then, after I was finished, I came here to Canada. I spent some time in Winnipeg as a nurse. Canada has been very good to me.
What made you fall in love with Winnipeg?
Well, I really like Winnipeg because we had a lot of your people there. And I was able to experience quite a lot of things that went on.
I think that what we often miss as Canadians is the fact that many of us who come from the British Caribbean, like you do from Guyana, are bringing with us the very same traditions because we're part of the British Commonwealth.
Yes, that's right.
And that we choose Canada very strategically as our point of migration for many, because there is something here certainly that we recognize and that is meaningful to us, and that there are many, many, many stories of women like you and men like you who came.
Okay, Sybil, thank you very much for that. Okay, we've got Connie from the Philippines. Hi, Connie.
Hi. I have been in Canada for almost 30 years. I came here because, as you know, in 1986, it's the first bloodless revolution that happened in the world when Marcos was the president at that time. So people were just so tired of the politics at that time and how the government is being administered. I said to my husband, I think it's time to immigrate to Canada. So when we applied for Canada, our main objective was only for the bright future of our 4 children. So my husband left a very good, high-paying and high position in the Philippines, and so our relatives and friends were just questioning our decision to come to Canada. But then we always said, it's not for us, it's for our children. But we did not know that we will be beneficiaries of the great health system here in Canada. In 2011, my husband, he had a kidney failure.
I'm sorry to hear that.
So he had to undergo dialysis for 5 years. And unknowingly, I also had a kidney disease, which was caused by an autoimmune disease. I'm just so thankful for us staying here in Canada, because if not, my husband and I would have been dead a long time ago in the Philippines.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, as they say, everyone's got a story, and clearly our audience members are no exception. And coming up, our panelists will give us their final thoughts.
On Facebook, Janice comments about our social isolation episode. I understand the use of virtual reality for social isolation, she writes, but that could also lead to many people simply escaping to a digital world. Jason tweets about the pot episode and having addiction specialist Keith Singer as the only opponent to legalization. He writes, I think there should have been more support for the fellow in the pink shirt. It seemed kind of one-sided. Via email, Danielle shares her Zoomer taping experience. She writes, I love that Zoomer offers these studio audience experiences, and especially when the topics are so fun and informative. The spring taping was a blast, and I look forward to the next one. Thank you, Danielle. Keep the comments coming in, and don't forget to log on to www.thezoomertv.com for full episodes and more.
Okay, panel, now it's time for your final thoughts. Let's start with you, Andrea.
As I reflect on Canada's 150th birthday, I am grateful for those who have walked before me, so the Indigenous peoples who have laid a framework on which this nation was built, and all of the early founding members, including a very long line of African Canadians beginning in 1604, who worked alongside the earliest peoples in this country to help establish it, first as slaves, later coming as loyalists, as people who fought to defend the borders of this country in 1812, who came in the early migration of the 20th century into Western Canada, into the prairies, into Nova Scotia. And then for those of us who came later, to be respectful of all of those contributions and to think of us as not having arrived, but of becoming, right? And always seeking to become better. The next time around when we pause to think, we want to know that we have traveled a little further.
Immigrants are truly a remarkable group of people. There's not many people out there who would leave everything that they know and people that they know and their families to go to a completely different land with different surroundings, a different system, that might not recognize their credentials and yet still struggle and strive and raise their families. Immigrants become the family hero because they are the ones who came here and created this life for us.
Well, I come from a family of refugees. My name is from Alsace, Lorraine. I'm French. My great-grandfather Louis came to Canada in about 1870 because in Alsace, the decree was you speak German, and if you want to be German, you stay here. I share some of the feelings of an immigrant, having been created by immigrants. Immigration is so important for Canada. We are leaders in the world in terms of the whole business of making welcome. We're not perfect, that's for sure, but in any event, I think that Canada is a banner carrier for freedom of expression, freedom of choice, and freedom to live here in the best country in the world called Canada.
When my grandfather came to Canada in 1912, he was an immigrant from Great Britain, and there were signs in the streets of Toronto at that time that said no British need apply in terms of jobs. He was fortunate, he and his brother, to get work. It underscores the reality that all immigrants who come to this country have difficulties initially, and for the most part, transcend them. Unless you're an Indigenous person, you either are an immigrant or are a descendant of immigrants. And I think it behooves us on Canada Day to look back as to where we came from and what it was that drew our ancestors here, as so eloquently described by the General, and what drove my grandfather to come here, which was economic opportunity. And that we have all, if we've been here long enough, have reaped the benefits of it. And so we have a lot to be grateful for. We're a very blessed nation.
If from this birthday, 150 years, so young, I think we are on the good track to see for the next 150 years coming a much, much, much better Canada as we will continue fighting for it. I really want to give a toast for this birthday to the First Nation who, in their flesh, in the identity which doesn't really exist anymore, has walked with us, immigrants or not, we all immigrants actually, just to try to pass over the pain and look for this reconciliation.
The first thing is I like to look forward in life. I have this thing about going forward. And with all recognition of how many places where we can discuss the terrible parts of history of Canada, what has gone wrong, I sometimes also like to focus on what can go right and what has gone right. I want to quickly ask a question, and I'm going to do some magic here, make something disappear. And you only have 1, 2 words if you want to answer. When you were little, what did you want to be? Princess,
First,
whatever?
ballerina, maybe, then an actress, maybe, then a writer.
Good.
A flight attendant.
A flight attendant?
I wanted to be a queen. That's why I named myself Elizabeth.
Ah.
A fighter pilot.
Awesome.
TV announcer.
Catholic priest, and actually I almost became Catholic priest. Then I found love. So yes.
And I wanted to be a mad scientist and a race car driver. Really, believe me, the reason I did that and the magic was that a whole bunch of things disappeared. Skin color, gender, belief systems, point of origin, DNA, all those things disappeared. And we realized that everybody on this planet somewhere has a dream that they want to go to. That path may change. Obviously, it did for many people who immigrate. And that this place, I like to think, is a place where that can happen. Years ago, there's several of us here that would not be at this table.
Absolutely.
We wouldn't be in this building.
Yes.
We wouldn't have the jobs that we have.
Yes,
so I like that part of moving forward in that way, and that the diversity and equity, the whole focus on that's happening, not just at TRC, but in many places, is also making it better for my people, for your people, and for the minority, which is changing, it seems, these days. And that this whole evolution that we're part of, this whole vision that we're part of, it has become unique to be from somewhere else, part of something different, so we all have something to share. And if it wasn't that way, we wouldn't have much to share because we would all know what we're talking about. So I think we all bring something to the table. That is one of my dreams. So when my little boy grows up, he'll be part of that table. He'll be part of that talk. Because when I'm old and gone and done talking, he'll be standing here talking.
Yes. Amen to that. And we have come to the end of our celebration. Now it's time to zoom out.